All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. I hope all is well at your end of the internet, wherever you happen to be. This is part 2 of Ask the Experts series, What Publishing Channels Make Sense? An interview with Joe Gollner, Val Swisher, and Scott Abel. I'm Jack Molisani, the moderator today. I published the LavaCon Conference on Digital Media and Content Strategies, and we will be addressing publishing channels and how it affects you, how it affects devices, and where do we go from here. The sponsor of our webinar today is DCL. Here's some information you can read later, but I find it interesting that DCL has converted more than 1 billion pages of content into various formats. In the area of content conversion, we are not talking about small little jobs. The bigger the enterprise, the more complex the projects get. And when you look at some clients, say, such as DCL has, they really bring a expertise to the game. And we're going to be talking a little bit about how that expertise comes to play when doing your digital conversion or authoring projects. All right, a few housekeeping notes. This is part 2 of our series. Part 1 is available online. We will be emailing out a recording of today's program and a link to the previous part 1 program, so you can see that if you didn't happen to make it. The hashtag for this event is DCL Experts. We're going to have 1 hour. We'll do about 45 minutes of discussion, followed by a question and answer period. We are monitoring, Vincent, our producer, is monitoring the chat room, and we'll be calling through questions. Probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll definitely try to get to as many as we can. All right, let's introduce the experts. Joe, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, Jack. I'm here in beautiful, sunny Ottawa, and yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Val?
Good morning from very sunny Silicon Valley. Thanks for having me.
And Scott Abel.
I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Show of hands. Okay, good.
There we go.
And we do have the experts' Twitter handles on the screen. Feel free to tweet away. All right. So today we're going to be talking about ebooks, and traditional publishers have been jumping on the ebook bandwagon from a very early stage because they definitely see a monetary gain in doing so. Today, however, we're going to be focusing on corporations and corporate publishing and how corporate enterprises are evaluating whether or not to go into ebooks, and if so, in which direction. All right, let's start with some statistics. Scott, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I will. I think the important thing to know is that ebooks are taking off in the traditional sense. In other words, book publishers are selling ebooks. In fact, they are expected to sell a record $2.7 billion by the end of this year, which is a 72% growth over last year. What's really interesting about that is that the people who purchase ebooks are not really having a price freakout, because the average pricing is $7 for a typical ebook. There are lots of issues surrounding that, like the quality of the book matching up to the price. So the more expensive that the ebook is, and the more functionality, the higher quality the readers expect. But even at the lower price point, there are some complaints about poor quality conversions in ebooks. So I thought it was really interesting that U.S. consumers are expected to purchase this many ebooks this year, especially when you consider all the devices that they have to watch the content on or read the content on.
Now, is that being cannibalized at the price of printed content?
Well, that was the fear of book publishers, but as it turns out, that's not the case. There are numerous statistics that help you understand that, one of which is the fact that you are seeing an increase in book purchasing, physical book purchasing and reading amongst people who purchase ebooks. So it may just be that people who read ebooks like to read.
All right.
Some of the other statistics, 1 in 5 Americans say they read ebooks. There have been some surveys that show about 20% of Americans consume digital content in the form of traditional books. There are also magazines and newspapers that add to that, making the total traditional publishing a lot higher than that. The readers of ebooks are more likely to purchase books than to borrow them, and interestingly enough, they're also willing to buy them. They don't have to steal them. Of course, it's a little different now because by the time ebooks came out, they were protected with digital rights management software to prevent theft. Of course, creative people could find a way to steal content despite the protections put on there. But unlike music, which escaped onto the internet and the recording industry was basically gobbled up by third parties like Apple through their iTunes and making deals directly with the consumers and the authors of the music. The record companies got cut out of the mix, and certainly record stores. So it's important for us to think about the fact that books are a little different. Of course, also, 20% of all the books sold last year in the U.S. were ebooks. That's important to know. That's going to skyrocket. I think that this is something that we have to really pay attention to, because the more people who read ebooks and the more availability, then the more the expectations will be raising, right? We're going to see consumers start to demand more for their money. They're going to want to have certain types of books displayed on devices that can take advantage of functionality of the device. In this case, young adult and children's books categories are really hot right now. Cookbooks, coffee table books, they expect to command a higher price, and they're often interactive. Things like fashion, art, science, those things are really taking off, and so are textbooks.
I would think that the mere fact that young adults are buying into ebooks is just going to predict that they, as adults, would in turn buy more ebooks.
Well, I think that you're going to have to wait for that to bear out. As it turns out, the younger people are not likely to have the higher-end devices. The higher-end devices are actually possessed by 40 and 50-year-olds, at least in the United States. That will change as those devices are cloned and made available at lower price points. So we'll have to see where this all leads. Mobile devices, this is the most important thing I think we can take away from this. These are all mobile devices. They are fast replacing desktop computers. And according to Forrester, after consumers purchase a tablet computer like the iPad, they are less likely to engage with media on traditional computing devices. That means that except for television, once somebody has a better experience on a mobile device, they take that experience with them on their mobile device, and they don't return to the same computer. In fact, computer chip sales are declining, while chip sales and materials that make tablets are escalating. So that it's a clear path right here that these devices will become at least major players, if not dominant. Tablet ownership, though, also impacts the purchases that consumers make. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that the channels or the stores that you buy digital products are organized, and how the ease with which you can purchase products on the device of your choosing.
Getting back to the chip sales of laptops versus mobile devices, might part of what is going on the fact that my laptop does everything it needs to, and I don't really need to upgrade it for any decent reason, yet I want a mobile device, so if I'm going to spend more money, that's where I'm going to invest in it.
So I think this is a matter of categorization. First of all, a laptop is a mobile device, but desktop workstations are declining. We want our employees at enterprises, small and large, to be mobile, so we're replacing their desktop traditional computer with laptops. We've been doing this for about a decade. But now the impetus is also that consumers own their own, and so they're bringing these to the workplace. This is BYOD, or bring your own device to the party, so to speak. And that's really playing a huge role in what is being sold. You have consumers buying their own products, maybe 2 or 3 devices that they own that are technically mobile devices. Then they also have consumer electronic devices. So you'll see game consoles or computers, and so are their family television kind of boxes. Think Apple TV, for example. And then you're also going to see Apple and other companies go into creating television and entertainment systems, which are basically computers. And so the mobile device thing is because the world is mobile. So you're going to see Earthlings in general possessing devices. Right now, about 3/4 of the world's population has access to a mobile device. Doesn't mean they own it, it means they have access to it. In developing nations, that's expected to switch from just being traditional cell phones, which would be not smartphones, but the older school flip phone kind of phones with a limited texting capability. They expect by 2014 the dominant device to be smartphones. Now, these will probably be lower price, lower end, brand new phones, and then they will be recycled versions of our earlier phones. Even Apple iPhone version 1s are starting to show up in some African nations as recycled materials.
It's also interesting that I see parallelism going on because I just spent the weekend with some friends, and while my friend was watching TV, he had a tablet on his laptop, whether it was reading, chatting. So there's this multitasking going on where a consumer is not just consuming one type of media at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the multi-screen thing, exactly. And there's a study on that. The Pew Internet and American Life project has a study on multi-screen use.
Cool. In part one of this series, we were talking about the different types of ebooks and devices on which they're read. We also talked about some of the issues in producing ebooks from scratch versus converting your content. We're not going to retrace those steps. That is available in the first recording. But as we move forward, it's taking a content and just dumping it into an electronic file and calling it an ebook is not the same as creating a media-rich ebook experience. The question then becomes, what is your company trying to accomplish? Is it just throwing something online so it's accessible, or are they trying to upsell or link to various other contents? A really good resource for distinguishing what are the various options is ebook101.com.
Well, it's in this URL is ebooks101book.com, and it actually clearly defines the difference between the three basic types of ebooks, and I'll recap them for the people who weren't on our last show. So there are basic ebooks, which are no more than digital photocopies. They're basically a save as function where anything that you saw on a piece of paper or on your screen of the computer can now be displayed on a mobile device, to which I reply, big deal. Then there are enhanced ebooks. Now these get exciting because you start to be able to have functionality. So basically anything that you can have on a web page, you can have in an enhanced ebook. The third category is ebooks as apps, where they are standalone pieces of software that take advantage of the operating system for which they were designed and the devices that run the operating system and all the functionality that comes with it. So that's where creativity really can run wild, and you can do amazing things, which could just be amazing in their own, or they could be amazing at amazing value to the content that you are enhancing. So these are the three categories: basic, enhanced, and ebooks as apps.
All right. Question for Joe. We started this conversation saying that we're looking at publishing channels and what is right for my organization. So let's just start. What is a channel?
Okay, well, I really like the word channel, and it does convey the idea of I call it a business pathway. It's a connection between a producer and a consumer. So you can think about it, it's a sales channel between someone with something to sell and a customer. It's a support channel for a user who can't get something to work right. Or it's a process channel that a business partner is going to be using to conduct business, to provide spare parts or what have you. So channel is best thought of as a business pathway. And as soon as we think of it that way, then you think, okay, at one end we have a customer, we have a user in a very particular situation, a context, and they're going to have a device, and that device have certain capabilities, and we follow that pathway all the way back to, on our side, we have content. And for it to really be a channel, we have to have all the dots line up so that you have a connection.
Say more about that last statement. What do you mean by having the dots lined up? If I have an iPad, isn't that my publishing channel?
That's exactly that's a really good point. And in fact, by saying dots, I was sort of leading to among the dots are the platforms or the physical devices in your hands. So an iPad or a Kindle or a Samsung Galaxy Note. Now that's one of the dots. Now those platforms run applications. So you could actually run a Kindle application on your iPad. So you have then an application. Those applications have very particular format requirements. So, you follow these dots. So the format requirement then leads back to what are the ways you can present your content, deliver your content, and that leads you all the way back to in what form do you actually manage that content so you can satisfy all of these channels that can be presented to you. So that's why I said dots. So there's a number of technical pieces that all have to connect to establish a really good channel or pathway between a producer and a consumer. And one of the key things to underscore is the fact that you don't get to control the channel. People, buy tools, they swap their apps, they change their environment, what's in their hand, with remarkable speed. And on top of that, of course, the market changes on a near daily basis. As a producer of content, none of us get to choose what the channels are going to look like. So to be honest, that fact privileges what we call open standards. And it drives us to move further and further back in the life cycle to say, how do we manage our content so that we can handle any requirement, even ones we haven't thought of yet. And that, like we see on the slide here, that leads us to thinking very much about XML as a master format.
And when you say we can't control the channels, one of the things we might be able to control is which channels we choose to publish on.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it is something we'll probably touch on several times in the next few minutes. But you can always place your bets, and this is what many publishers are now challenged to do: is decide which channels are they going to put their investment behind. And there's some obvious big ticket items, or really mandatory ones. But these all change, and they are continually adapting. And this, ideally, in a perfect world, publishers would position themselves in a way where, yes, they can make choices on the channels they're going to invest in, but they can respond very rapidly and with a very low overhead to new ones, to changing channels. The danger really that's lurking behind the scenes is putting all your bets on one or two channels, and then before you know it, there's a big major announcement from that, from Apple, for example, and then suddenly your preferred channel has to undergo a major change, or a new entrant appears in the marketplace, and suddenly you're scrambling to make sure that your content will also make it to that target.
I think it's interesting that at one point there was a huge debate about should we go Betamax or VHS, and now both those are basically gone.
Absolutely, and that has, and we will touch on it a little bit later, but throughout the history of publishing, there have been lots of bets put down on an up-and-coming channel, and only to see, as you just pointed out, that the whole game changes, and not only was that bet wrong, but all associated bets were wrong.
All right, HTML5, big buzzword. What is it? Why is it important?
HTML5 is really, it's almost the culmination of what will be 20 years of work on the hypertext markup language. And it is taking a long time to sort of make its way out into the world as an officially endorsed W3C recommendation. But HTML5 brings together many really good trends in web publishing over the years. And so HTML5 brings together the best that's been done using XHTML, which is an XML implementation of the hypertext markup language, of a number of initiatives using the resource description framework, and probably most importantly, HTML5 gives us a declarative way to introduce really interesting functionality for mixing text and video and audio and giving us a canvas in which we can do things that in the past you always had to use a proprietary plugin, for example, Flash. Now HTML5 brings together really the best practices over the last 20 years and some of the really, really interesting capabilities into one standard. And then we look to the industry to implement HTML5 as completely and consistently as possible across all the browsers. And because HTML5 is taking some time to come through the standards process, and it's really because people are putting good work in on it, this means that there's one standard, and as much as the vendors like Microsoft and Google like to compete, if there's one strongly endorsed and good standard, by and large the market will line up, will be forced to line up and give us good support for HTML5. And we're already seeing that today. So HTML5 is a really good thing.
All right, but that sounds like it's very web browser-ish. What does that have to do with eBooks?
Good question. In fact, with the EPUB standard, HTML5 is basically the encoding that's used within ebook representations. And I would expect over the next few years that much of what we describe as enhanced ebook functionality will in fact be encoded inside those ebooks as HTML5. Because HTML5, just to use a textbook example, HTML5 introduces support for the MathML, the mathematics markup language. So now all the formulas will be, just native. They will be described in XML as formulas, and they will display properly in your ebook. And better still, if you're running exercises, they're actually formulas that you can process.
So we don't have to display them in Word, take a screenshot, and drop a graphic into our ebook?
Yes, hopefully that's a thing of the past, yes.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about content. Let's talk about distribution. And in this presentation, we're talking about channels as a way of selling or distributing your ebooks. And by selling, it doesn't necessarily have to be for a monetary amount. What do you think about this, Val?
So I'm glad you went there because I was going to jump in. Selling is trading something. So it could be money, but it also could be contact information, your time. So if I'm going to give you the ebook content, I'm going to sell it to you, that's going to be in exchange for something. So whether that's actually monetized or whether it's your contact information so that now you become a lead that I can then try to convert into a sale, we need to keep in mind that selling isn't always for money. And I think in the business world, most of the time we're not selling our ebook content for money.
Well, for years we've been saying if you want a copy of our white paper, give us your name, address, and email address. Isn't this the same?
Well, yeah, it is. It's very, very similar, except now we have an opportunity to provide different kinds of content and more content, and we really need to go back. Like you said in the beginning, an ebook is not just a PDF that you've now called an ebook. So to some extent it is the same, but to some extent it's very different.
So if we look at we're selling a product in exchange for money or information, we need a place to sell it, say a mall. Well, wait a minute. If my audience is on iPads and iPhones, they're going to go to the iTunes store. Well, how are they going to get your ebook if it's on your website and not in the iTunes store or vice versa?
So the point you're bringing up is really well served. There are a variety of ways that businesses can distribute their ebook content, and one of them is on their website. And some people believe that that's the best place to do it because you can collect all this information and you can control it, and there's a process called side loading, and you can sideload the ebooks, et cetera, et cetera.
What does that mean, sideloading?
Sideloading is when you actually download the file and then you put it onto your tablet or your reader, as opposed to when you're in the iBook store and you say, give me the iBook, and it automatically loads.
Okay.
So you can do that. There is also the notion of standard things like emailing an ebook, right, or giving it out on a thumb drive at a conference. But as you're saying, a lot of people are expecting to get their ebook content from a store. So if it is for my iPad or my iPhone, then I'm expecting to go to an Apple store. If it's for my Kindle, I'm expecting to go to Amazon. And I think that some of this goes back to what Joe said, which is where are you going to place your bets? Which channels are you going to put your investment in? So there are a variety of places that you can put your content.
Part of the process would then be almost like the 80-20 rule. Where are we going to get most of our exposures most of the time by which store we're putting it into? Wouldn't that kind of require an audience analysis to find out who are your audience and what stores are they looking at?
Absolutely. In fact, the step that we've missed in this discussion is really what is your content strategy. You really have to have a strategy to understand why are you creating this content in the first place. Is it because an ebook is a bright, shiny object and everybody else is doing it? Or is it because it truly fits in to your overall content strategy and it plays a role? Once you're in that mode of thinking, you're not just out there creating ebooks because you can and you want to. Then you can look at your audience, look at the devices that they have, look at the platforms, pick your best place to get the most people, and make some decisions in a much more educated way. But keep in mind that you're still risking missing some people because there are multiple places that you can put your ebook content.
So if someone was a corporate publisher, and by that we mean anybody working in a large enterprise that has content they want to get out there, would somebody from the marketing end of that company already be thinking about this? So instead of you making your own independent decision, you should be crossing silos within your own company?
Oh yeah, that's true for your entire content strategy. So if you're putting out ebook content that is procedural because you're in a support organization, you may have your own ideas about where your customers are going to be looking for that content. But if you don't already know the channels that are being developed by your marketing team or your tech doc team or your training team, then now you're going to really confuse your customers. Because there's so many ways to distribute ebooks and because there are so many platforms, it's imperative that you have an overall corporate strategy or you're just going to have a bunch of very confused customers. I'm going to go here for my marketing, I'm going to go here for my tech doc, I'm going to go here for training, I'm going to go here for tech support. It's going to be a mess.
Alan Porter does this great session on making a business case for a chief content officer position in companies for that very reason.
Yeah, and that's becoming more and more popular, the chief content officer idea, because everything a company does is content. We have to have a strategy.
Okay. So assuming, getting back to our white paper analogy, that we're publishing digital content as a means of creating new customers or upselling existing customers, what are the benefits and liabilities of, say, taking that content and putting it in the Apple store or the Kindle store where you don't have that opportunity to control what comes next?
It's a good question. It really all goes back to the strategy. As we were talking earlier before the webinar started, if you have an iPad, you have the opportunity to download other reader apps, and the Kindle app for iPad is one of the most popular iPad apps. So a case could be made to say, well, find the distribution channel that is likely to be the most ubiquitous. So if I publish it out on a Kindle format, then my iPad can read it. it's all part of the strategy. It's very hard to predict where your users are going to go. But
so what can you do? Hold on. If that's true, and we're publishing this where they are, as we should be, how do we then get them back to your website or additional content that you want them to see? What are ways of doing that?
Well, a lot of the stores are able to give you certain stats about downloads and everything else, but I think the best way to do it is to create interactions in your ebook experience that actually bring people to your site. So give them quality information and include those links that take them back to your company, your site, your product. That's part of the magic and the power of having interactive ebooks.
And I think a good example of that would be Amazon's announcement back in April that they're going to be releasing the James Bond books as ebooks. They're not just going to be the original books. They're going to pull in music. They're going to pull in clips from the movies. They're going to link back to various merchandising opportunities, all of which are probably going to make more money for them than the sale of the book itself.
Bingo. Bingo. And another example is iFixit. With iFixit, when you're looking at a procedure on how to dismantle your iPhone and do something to it, you can click right there in that interface to buy the special screwdrivers or whatever tools you need. So it's giving your customers the content and the access that they need to enhance their experience. And people are going to come to expect that.
And just share with the audience, what's the website for iFixit?
I believe it's ifixit.com.
Okay, good.
ifixit.com. So yeah, they're great.
All right, let's bring this back to Scott, because you said something earlier that I want to dive into a little bit further, is that there's this common misperception where people say, oh, I have an iPad, I like that better than Android as a publishing channel. What's the fallacy in that?
Well, it's kind of like apples and avocados. They both start with A, and you can eat them, and they might be green, but they're not the same thing at all. In fact, the iPad, like the iPod and the iTouch, the iPod Touch and the iPhone are devices. Those are physical things that you can buy that are products. They run an operating system called the iOS operating system. Conversely, Android is an operating system. It's a software system that runs on a variety of different brands of devices made by an increasing number of companies. And Android comes in various flavors. So unlike the iOS, which is pretty much an Apple piece of software, an operating system that runs on Apple devices, the Android software can run on a variety of devices, and it can be supported at different levels. In fact, I know that you have a story, Jack, about how you had asked me about a tablet. Why don't you tell the audience about that?
Scott, you were right. I'll just say it and get it out of the way. The bank I bank with had a points system that was being discontinued. And you had to use your points by the first of the month or lose them. And I had enough points to get a tablet device, so I ordered it. And it was an Android device, and I have an Android-based smartphone, so I just assumed I would get a similar interaction on a bigger screen on a device. Come to find out, it was just the device itself only built as a book reader. So even though there was an icon in the control panel for the Google Game Store, when I clicked on it, it says this feature is not supported by this device. And it really brought home to me that, oh, wait a minute, you just can't look at the operating system and assume all that functionality is going to be there. You really have to look one level deeper and look at the device that operating system is running on to see what does the device support. And Scott, you mentioned something about Netflix, how many devices they support.
Yeah, I just talked with the people that run the Netflix distribution for video and television content, and they support 820-some mobile devices. So for those of us who are thinking in terms of 12 devices or 4 devices or 3 different device types, it's not true. There are so many different types of devices that are capable of consuming different types of content. It's important for us to know that, to Joe's point, that the consumer decides what device they're going to bring to the party, and we decide whether or not we are going to provide content in a way that they can consume it. So we'll end up limiting the amount of exposure that someone has. And I think the important thing about your story, Jack, is that you had an expectation as a customer of what you thought something would do for you, right? Because you had an understanding in your mind of what Android means. And so we're technology people. We're flexible. We laugh about it. We admit sometimes that we just can't grasp everything. But imagine people who aren't interested or don't understand technology. They're not going to put up with this. They're going to go toward the path of least resistance, and whatever's the easiest for them. And this has been this way for years. When people move to a Mac and they like it and they think it's easier, they stay with it. When people who are on Windows and afraid to change to a Mac, they may think that Windows is easy because it's easy for them. It's an expectation, right? And so I think that's really critical.
So tell your dad Christmas present story.
So my dad's Christmas present story briefly is my sister, who shall remain nameless, purchased my dad an alternate brand of reader device called the Nook from Barnes & Noble, which now is supported partially by Microsoft, so it actually has some legs. It might actually be around for a while. This device was designed to do a variety of things, most important of which was read eBooks. My father hid after receiving the device in another room and called me and basically said, hey, I know you're not here for Christmas. Merry Christmas. Oh, Merry Christmas to you too, Dad. Hey, I've got a question. What's this Nook thing I just received as a present? So I explained what it was. Well, it didn't mean anything to him. All he wanted to know was, well, I have an iPad already, and I have an iTunes and an iBook account. If I already have all this content on my phone and on my computer and on my iPad, why do I need the Nook? I'm like, well, Dad, you don't necessarily need it, but do you want to keep it? He said, I don't know. Can I open up all my Apple content on it? I'm like, no. So immediately he said, well, I have to have another account? I said, yes. He goes, I'm not doing that. I'm going to have to re-gift this. Don't tell your sister. So the lesson there is that the opportunity cost, the cost of taking an opportunity to switch, is too high, and managing multiple accounts is not attractive to people.
And part of this is kind of predicting the future and looking into your crystal ball, going, where do you think the industry is going, and what eggs do you put in what baskets?
Yeah, I mean, I think guessing is dangerous for organizations, but as Joe was mentioning, and so was Val, there are ways that you can determine the likelihood of your success. And I think that by, first of all, stepping back and thinking about creating your content in a unified, platform-neutral, operating system agnostic content format like XML is the best way to start. Because you can then push that content to various devices more rapidly and without as much challenge.
Joe, isn't that what you found in your clients?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think probably my one key lesson that I would sort of summarize up over the years is that really avoid betting too heavily. None of us have proven to be very, very good at seeing the future, and with the rate of change that we're seeing in the marketplace today and in user behavior, it means betting heavily on one or two channels, key market channels, is just a recipe to be punished by change, and it will likely come a lot sooner than you think.
All right, so we talked about publishing channels. We talked about an audience analysis as far as what devices they are using, but isn't part of this kind of like the field of dreams scenario, where if you just put it out there, you can assume that some people will find it? How does that come to play, Val?
Well, I think that the idea that if you put it out there, they will come is a fallacy, unless you happen to be someone who's extremely well known and people are looking for you all the time. I think you really need to be much more strategic in the content itself, in why you're doing this to begin with, and then in where you're going to publish this. I think the field of dreams analogy has companies wasting a lot of money.
All right, so we haven't really talked about countries up to this point. We seem to have been taking a very U.S.-centric viewpoint. How does authoring in multiple languages affect what publishing channels you use?
Oh, this is my favorite topic. Because, yes, I think especially here in the U.S., we're just so U.S.-centric that we just figure everybody's downloading our content and our apps and everything in English, right? No, wrong. Very, very wrong. There are a number of things you need to keep in mind when you're going to be publishing in multiple countries. The first has to do with the devices themselves, the platforms. Not every platform is available in every country. So, for example, if you've decided that the Nook is your platform of choice, I hope you're not going to be doing anything in German for Germany because they don't have the Nook. So it's really important that you do your homework in terms of the devices that are available in the various geos that you want to go to. People make that mistake all the time. Another mistake that's made is how much bandwidth your content is taking up. In the U.S., many of us have unlimited bandwidth plans. And overseas, that's not the case. So if you're trying to push, I downloaded a fabulous iBook a couple of weeks ago, fabulous, but it was over a gigabyte. A gigabyte. It took forever to load, and actually it didn't load because I didn't have a gigabyte of space. I had to go delete things. But if I was paying for that data, I would be a very unhappy customer, very unhappy. So I think that that's another thing to really, really keep in mind. And of course, there's the usual suspects, like make sure that the culture, the mobile culture of the country is in line with what you're doing. Different countries have different cultures for mobile device usage. It's very, very interesting and very different. And the same is true for mobile apps. I today just read a white paper from Moravia Worldwide about the considerations for mobile apps. So it's also things like some languages go right to left. Some languages go top to bottom. What's the swiping activity of how you change your pages? There are a lot of things that we need to consider, and they need to be considered in advance.
And Scott, wouldn't one of the unintended consequences of this is developing all this content and realize that half the world can't read it?
Yeah, I think that that's because we use psychic power to determine how to guide our businesses, which is problematic. My crystal ball is cracked, and I still use it, and I will admit that sometimes those predictions aren't really coming true. And I think a lot of it is because we make assumptions that the world speaks English. And it turns out that many people in the world do understand English, and it is certainly a common language. But as it turns out, people dream and often search, which is how they find books, in their native language first. So just being able to obtain our content, whether it's a book or a marketing brochure or whatever in an ebook format, means that we're going to be able to relate and categorize with metadata in the languages of these targets that we have, so that when they search engines, which, by the way, this is another issue altogether, how do you optimize an ebook for a search engine if your search engine is Amazon or if your search engine is Apple and not Google? So all these things come to play. There's all kinds of consequences for the decisions. But what I think is interesting is the best practices that Joe and Val have been espousing are solid, and they're repeatable, and they're systematic. They're not really opinion-based. They're mathematical and science-based.
Okay, good. All right, so we're 47 minutes into the presentation. Vincent, can you offer up a question from the audience?
Yeah, actually, we got one right here that says, will HTML5 minimize the need for producing content for 800 different devices?
Joe?
Yeah, actually, I would say that yes, it will. You know, it still very much is a delivery format, but it's actually one of the unintended consequences is that HTML5 has a lot of the discipline of XML behind it and built into it. So you can use HTML5 with great discipline, which would mean that you have what we'll call adaptive content. In other words, the resource that you have is one that could be dynamically reformatted using different cascading style sheets to really cover a very wide range of devices. There still are some issues ultimately that might incline you to say, I'm going to have a master representation of our content in sort of a cleaner XML form from which we generate HTML5, but really HTML5 has so much capability. We can actually stage our content and adaptively, responsively deliver it into many of the devices we need to hit today.
Cool. All right, another question.
If ebooks aren't the end point of a sales funnel, how have some companies been measuring conversion of leads?
Ooh, Scott, do we have any?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again?
The full question is, how are companies measuring conversion of leads who have acquired content to customers of their service or product? In other words, if ebooks are not the end point of a sales funnel, how do they measure their effectiveness?
Okay, so there doesn't need to be an endpoint in the traditional stance. I think that there's a fallacy in the way that we think. We think that we create stuff and we put it out there, and the moment that the consumer interacts with it for the very first time is the data collection point for a quote-unquote lead, which I would challenge the definition of that vocabulary word in the first place. So just because somebody's interested in the content doesn't mean they're a lead, first of all. Second, the data collection point when you collect, let's say, their information, their contact email address or their name or phone number, who says it needs to occur prior to the download of a content object? So an ebook or a marketing brochure or, for that matter, a webinar recording. Why can't that content be offered up to somebody who expresses their interest by the click? The click could be the very first thing that you measure and pull them in. Let's say the click is to obtain an iBook or an enhanced ebook created in HTML5, for example, or a visit to a mobily enhanced, mobile-ready website. And then you engage them with the content, and they get what they wanted. You asked them, you said, hey, I've got this interesting thing, and you teased them, and they clicked, and the click says, I want that. I'm interested in your offer. If you engage them further, who says that we won't be engaging them and collecting the information inside the ebook? So why don't, there will be in-app, in-book advertising. There's been ads in books in the future, in the past, and they failed in print because, for the most part, periodical content like that is stale after a certain amount of time, and you never know if you'll see an ad, 5 years later in a garage sale or a secondhand bookstore, and how valuable is that? But with digital content, we can dynamically switch out the ads. They're just content objects, so we can dynamically deliver the content to the person, we can adapt it to them and personalize it, and then we can make it respond to the device on which they're consuming it. So why couldn't we also programmatically build in kind of a maturation process, a lead maturation process into our content and start interacting with people then? I think that's where you're going to get respect from your consumers instead of this, give me all your information or I won't give you this white paper I just asked you if you want it.
So we've got pulling in dynamic ads. You've got links to more information within the ebook that would then show up on a Google Analytics report somewhere saying this is where this user came from when they pinged your site.
Yeah, and even if it didn't, I can't for a minute think that Apple and Amazon and for that matter Google or anyone else isn't going to build enterprise level connectivity to that kind of information, to those analytics. I'd be surprised if they don't offer APIs to connect to systems like Salesforce. They're gonna cut out this middleman, and the middleman is the web page. If your web page is just a data collection point, and it's where you store a content object, why can't the content object, the ebook, the app, or whatever it is, be the data collection point? And so I think you're going to see a change in the approach over time. Will they still try to use traditional marketing in new products? Oh, sure. They still think Twitter's a fax machine.
Well, we mentioned earlier in the presentation that there's basically 3 ways of accessing content: through a web, through an ebook, or through an app. What about the whole give them what they want in a basic format, and if they want more, they can, and free, they can upgrade to a paid app or a paid subscription or paid content.
And if you say paid, it could also be paid by being more involved. It doesn't have to be money. So my bank does that. Union Bank of California, now unionbank.com, offers a mobilely enabled website. They also offer to their customers who already have accounts with them more features and functionality that you could obtain when you use a device app for Android or iPhone devices, so iOS devices or Android devices. And they do that because there are differences in the information needs and the commitment of people who are just browsing around trying to find a bank when they move to a new city. Once you become a customer, you have some transactional needs that an app can serve perhaps better, who knows, than some of the other alternatives.
All right, good. Next question.
You've discussed distribution of ebooks to external customers, but what is needed or available for ebook distribution to internal employees without using something like Amazon or iTunes?
Who can address this?
Repeat the
I
question?
guess that's depending
I'm
on
sorry,
what device is being used.
Yeah. What's available internally for employees?
Yeah, like I guess in iBooks you can just load up files on your own if you open them in the iBooks app. But I guess for other devices, is there any way to easily distribute ebook content or ebook-like content for like employees of a large corporation?
So if you want to keep it internal to the corporation, you could distribute it on your intranet. You could email it to people. There's little difference between distributing internal content and distributing external content, except you don't want to put it in public spaces. So I don't know of any companies that are creating their own version of like an iBook store or an Amazon store, but you certainly could have a place on your intranet where people can go and get their content and then sideload it onto their readers, or you can email it to them. You could put it on devices before you give it out to people. I think that's a pretty interesting idea. I haven't seen anyone do it, but I could imagine companies doing that.
I've got a prediction, although I'd love to hear Joe's point of view on this too. My prediction is, again, that these organizations that are serving traditional publishers today, or actually who are serving the customers of traditional publishers and bookstores today, so digital consumers of ebooks and apps, I think that the people who publish these in corporations, so marketing materials and all kinds of sales materials, literature, information of all types, I think they're going to get catered to by these big companies, Apple and Amazon, and I think you're going to be, I would be surprised if you didn't see in an embeddable iTunes store that you can grab a piece of code and put it on your own website, and that you could use the infrastructure and the payment processing and the community that they have, but you could just embed a piece of code and it would display a private ebook store using the same functionality, or maybe it would be a public one. It would behoove them to do it, because instead of dragging people back to the iTunes store or Amazon, where obviously millions of people do love to shop, they would also be able to extend their brands, those e-commerce stores, by giving us code that we could enable on our own websites. Joe, what do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, I have a customer right now, and they basically have constructed their own sort of iTunes or iBook store. And what's interesting is that they really have emphasized capabilities like enhanced functionality for the user, obviously things like really very intelligent smart search. But more interestingly, it facilitates the gathering of metrics so that they have a way to monitor how often certain parts of the reference material are being used by practitioners. Now, in this case, it's accountants accessing things like tax law. But it suddenly, so I do see that as an area of great value. So I would expect the big players to see this as a real value offering that they could provide to the institutional customer to help them sort of gain a feel for their own community of users and their use of their content. But certainly this one application that I'm sort of involved with now about sort of giving tax auditors access to everything you ever want to know about taxes and tax history, case history, and then being able to see exactly how things are being used and facilitating discussions. This is a huge value to that organization, to that community. And so where there's value, the big fish aren't far away.
Okay, good. It looks like that's going to be our last question. We are going to be sending out an email with the recording to both this presentation and the first in the series. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsor, DCL. And here's the contact information for our speakers. And then finally, mark your calendars. We're going to be doing part 3 of Ask the Experts Planning for the Future on July 25th, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific time. I'm Jack Molisani, and I'd like to thank Joe, Val, and Scott